All right, folks. So like I said, this is the last little piece of Lesson 8 that we didn't get to yesterday. And this slide is about how we give organisms their scientific name. We saw yesterday how we put them into groups. A guy named Carl Linnaeus, sort of started or came up with this system, and it has changed slightly and been modified over time. But the basics of this system are still what we use to name organisms scientifically. Binomial, oh, sorry, this. Where's my pen? Pen. There we go. So binomial means two names. And nomenclature is where we talk about a naming system. You probably saw this word in Science 10 when you talked about chemical nomenclature. So really what we're saying is this is a naming system where we give each organism two names. Kind of like how you have a first name and a last name. Same sort of idea here. Now, when we're talking about an organism's scientific name, it's actually a little bit backwards from how we use names in English, but in other languages, this is how people's names work. The first word of the name is where we put their genus. Notice how I wrote the G with a capital letter. That was on purpose. The genus is like the group that you belong to. So if we make an analogy with people, my last name is Baxter. It would be the first name in my scientific name because it's the group that I belong to. Okay? So the first name is the organism's genus, and we would certainly have this capitalized. Now, depending on whether you're printing or whether you are like with your hand, or whether you were typing something out, the rule can be different. Typically, what will happen is that we will underline if we are writing, or, and I'll try my best to write, we'll use italics if we're typing things. So you'll see very often that when something is typed, like I've typed those names with a computer, I'll just use italic font. I'm not very good at writing in italics just with my hand and a pen. So that is why you have the choice to underline or use italics. So if we take humans as an example, does anyone know the first word of our scientific name for our species? I heard someone say it. Someone said it out loud. So the first word of our scientific name is Homo. The second name in the system with two names would be the organism's species name. Notice this is a lowercase. And again, we would either underline or use italics. So the second name for a human would be sapiens. We would underline it. And if we wanted to put it all together and give the scientific name of our species, we would say Homo sapiens. Now, no one is expecting that you memorize the scientific name of any one species. I would expect that you know how to make it if I give you the group that the organism belongs to. So if I gave you a table like the one we looked at yesterday that had the organism's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, would you be able to tell me, if you had that information, which two words to use to make their scientific name? Okay? Just so that you understand, for interest, here are a few scientific names, because I thought I would tell you how they come up with these scientific names. The first one, cute little bear, its scientific name is Phascolarctos cinereus. If I look at those words, and I think back to the first day of bio, where we said that each bio word is actually just little small words put together, Phascolose means pouch, Arctos means bear, and Cinereus means ash-colored. So its scientific name is just taken from other languages to say exactly what it looks like. It is a little gray bear with a pouch, and so that's where its scientific name comes from. Sometimes there's a third word. So if you see up here, I put binomial with a star. That is because, like I mentioned yesterday, of course, we started this system, and then we keep discovering new things and realizing we might need extra names or extra words. So in some organisms, you might see a third word so that their species can be more specific. It might be their subspecies name. I'm not going to ask you to identify any examples where a third word is present, but just so that you know, in life, if you're looking at the scientific name of an organism and there's a third word, that's why. Other reasons that organisms get their names, where we find them, and that's a pretty common thing. If you look at the name of the alligator, its scientific name is Alligator mississippiensis because you find it near the Mississippi River. So sometimes the place that they are found, whether it's the region or the country or the name of a monument that's close to them, like in this case it's a lake, that sometimes shows up in the scientific names of things. Maybe you've heard of the Albertosaurus before. It's a dinosaur, got its name clearly because it lived here, Alberta. But those are just some of the reasons that scientific names happen. You don't have to memorize, like I'm not going to quiz you on why an organism has a scientific name. This is just so that you know where they come from. I wanted to mention, because sometimes this type of question comes up because we're not asking you to memorize things, we're asking you to understand. Something like this might happen. Let's say that I had some made-up organisms. So pretend those were two other species that are completely imaginary. I just made them up right now. Pretend sapiens and Homo ficus. And I asked you, which of those two is more closely related to us? What would you pick? Okay, Kaylee, you had your hand up first. You tell me which one you'd pick. And why would you pick Homo ficus? It's a confusing thing, yes? But not the same group. So here's something that I want to show you. This word, the species word, in some cases in reality is reused, where even though two organisms are not even closely related to each other at all, they might have the same word as their species name. Think about it like your first name. I know lots of other people who are named Melissa, but I am not related to them. Just because their name is Melissa doesn't mean that we have any close relationship at all. Sapiens is like your first name. If you think about the genus, it's like your family name. If someone's last name is Baxter, there's a way better chance that I'm related to them than if their name is Melissa, because Baxter is our family name. It's the group that I belong to. And so when you look at names like this, I would certainly agree with your first impulse to say that Homo ficus is more closely related because they are definitely in the same genus. Pretend sapiens, I don't know what their genus isn't the same, and that might mean that their family, order, class, phylum, all of those other levels aren't the same either. So if I had to pick and I had no other information, I would pick Homo ficus because it's in the same genus. Okay? Anyone want to ask anything else there? It's a tricky little thing. Here. Lesson 9 is about dichotomous keys, which is a way or a tool that scientists use to help them classify organisms. So it relates to the last lesson because we said that they do classify them, and this is a tool. So first I'm going to tell you about what it's like, show you an example, and then you will start working on making your own dichotomous key. So this first little bit is a description of what it is. So that you know, I'm giving you this description not because I'm going to ask you on a test what is the definition of a dichotomous key, I would ask you to make one or to use one. But if you don't know what it is, then it might be hard to make one. So it's a tool. It's a tool used by taxonomists, so people who study taxonomy, to identify the name, or sometimes if they want to be fancy, they'll call it the taxon, which is the group, of an unknown organism. Now, some of you might have actually used one of these before and just not called it this. I know that my daughter in grade 1 went outside, picked up leaves, and put them in categories based on what shape they were and what color they were. She was making a dichotomous key, she just didn't call it that. And so you might have used one of these classification tools before. Specifically, a dichotomous key is a series of numbered statements. And each of these numbered statements has a pair. A pair means 2. Di in the dichotomous key means 2. But it will have a pair of alternative. And by alternative, we mean opposite, observable characteristics. And I put observable in bold because we have to be able to observe this trait if we're going to use this tool to classify organisms. So we have a numbered statement. In that numbered statement, there are 2 choices, and each of the 2 choices will either lead me to the next set of statements, like a choose your own adventure, or tell me which organism it is that I'm looking at, and that will be the end of the path. So later, when you are making a dichotomous key, and you want to check and make sure that you're doing it right, if you can say yes to this bit of instruction here, then you are probably doing it right. Now I know that this instruction makes little sense unless you can see an example of what this looks like. So I'm giving you the instruction first, and then I'm going to show you what that would look like with real objects in a dichotomous key. So the example that we're going to look at is not with living organism, but rather with random stuff that was on my desk when I was making this. In this example, like what you will do, there's a group of things that I wanted to classify. So in the picture, you can see there's a highlighter, a pen, a paperclip, a pencil sharpener, and a pencil. Okay? Those are the objects I wanted to classify. Notice how there are 5 objects, and I have 4 statements. That is what should happen. However many objects or organisms you are trying to classify in a dichotomous key, whatever that number is, 1 less than that is the number of statements that you should have. Each of the numbered statements has 2 choices. So there is a 1A and a 1B. So I have a numbered statement, and there are 2 alternatives, the A and the B. There is not A, B, and C. There is not A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Each alternate, there has to only be 2. So in every statement, you can only have 2 choices. Notice how these 2 choices are the opposite of each other. It's very common, and I think it makes sense in a dichotomous key to use the word not or non. Long is the opposite of short. I think everyone could agree on that one. But what's the opposite of tubular? I don't know if I could pick one thing that is the exact opposite of tubular. However, I could say with certainty that either it is or it isn't tubular. So a tube is like a cylinder. That's the shape we're looking at. So either it is a cylinder or it's not a cylinder. I didn't name a different shape. If I did that, I would have left something out. So it's a really good idea to pick a trait and then say as your second alternative that it doesn't have that trait. That way there's no possibility that any organism would have a characteristic that falls in between your 2 alternatives. Each of the alternatives leads to another statement. So, when I looked at these objects, I thought, man, how could I put these things into groups? And I said, well, the first group I could make has to do with their shape. 3 things are long and kind of cylinder shaped, and 2 things aren't. When you have your group of objects or organisms that you're trying to classify, you should look for a big category like that first. Something where half of them go in one category and about half of them go in the other. It doesn't have to be exactly half. I have an odd number of objects here. But my first statement is something generic that would let me split my objects into 2 groups. Now, if it is long and tubular, and I say yes to that, then I look at question 2. If it's short and non-tubular, I go to a different question. And that's because now I'm looking at different objects, so I need different questions to differentiate them. Question number 2 is considering only these 3 objects. So I don't even really care about the paperclip and the pencil sharpener. Out of those 3 objects, when I look at them, one of them is not made out of plastic and the other 2 are. So my next statement was either that it's constructed from plastic or that it's not. Notice all I said was that it was constructed from something other than plastic. That is another way of saying not, of just not picking another material, but just saying it's not made out of the material the first choice was made out of. Notice in this one, I have a difference in terms of what happens. One of them tells me to go to another statement, and one of them ends the pathway. Since there was only one object that was long and tubular, made from something other than plastic, if it's the only thing left in its group, and I don't have to specify anymore, you just write the name of the object or the organism. If it's made from plastic, I have to go to another statement because there were 2 objects made out of plastic. So my 2 choices are that it's green and gray or that it's not green and gray. And you'll notice that I use the word not so that it would be the exact opposite rather than just saying that it was blue, which is what color it is. This way, if I had another object that I wanted to classify, and it was red, I could still use this classification tool. Number 4 is where I get to if I started with the short non-tubular objects. So these 2 objects are the topic of number 4. Either it's black and silver, like the pencil sharpener, or it's not black and silver, and then it's the paperclip. So that is an example of something that follows the rules of a dichotomous key. I have a list of numbered statements. Each of them has 2 opposite alternatives. Each alternative either tells me to go to another statement or identifies the object or organism that I was looking at.